are you?
I am fine. How are you?
Getting by, getting by.
So, like I had mentioned, I'm planning on writing an article about how an instrument, a tambura, was created from scratch in State College using local materials, using just local technology. So, from what I understand, very few of the items were actually procured from India, right? The pegs and the bridges and the those sorts of very small things, pretty much what you see on top of the finished shell. Only some of those things were from India, but the rest of it was all created in State colleges.
And frankly, because it was a prototype, we just substituted with pegs and the bridge from India. But
Right.
those things are easily creatable in America. There's no issues as
Okay,
far
good.
as.
That's good to know. That's good to know. So I found it really fascinating that you can have a working tambura, and Lata had actually played it for me when I was in State College. I loved the sound of it. So I would like to hear some stories about how this came about, this whole process of the initial decision-making process on saying that let's start with a tambura, for example. How did that happen? How did the discussion process happen? How it was Bhushan who took up the onus of actually making it? And what were the interesting things that happened down the line? Were there things like, God, we got into some more than, yeah, biting off more than we could chew? Did you ever feel like that at some point? All those issues is what I would like to hear about.
Okay, I can talk a little bit about the motivations behind it, and then I'll ask Kishan to talk about the process itself
Sure.
because he. So the idea behind this is whether it's tanpura or tabla, pakhawaj, mridangam, veena, anything, um, harmonium, esraj, anything that we need as far as instruments go, we have to obviously import from India. And typically, what we've noticed, especially, we've not worked with South Indian makers, obviously, because our discipline is North Indian music. What we've noticed is that as long as the customer is somebody who is well known or is a brand name
Mm.
in Hindustani music, the best materials are used, the greatest care is taken, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
And the instrument is very nice.
Okay. Okay.
And the thing about, just to add on to what Guruji said there for a split second, even when you go through a maker, like go through an established artist who will then help you procure those instruments, those artists are also, they don't tell the maker that this is going somewhere else. Even those artists have to fib to those. She's doing it out of the goodness of her heart for us, but she's not going to tell the maker that this is being sent to
I get that.
someone else. She's saying that they're going to my students in USA.
Yes, yes,
Only
yes,
then,
yes.
and then the added thing being, because she is who she is, the maker is, as a result, going through the process of making the instrument. She's checking everything, things are being tweaked, and then they will be shipped. Even the artist ordering the instrument has to fib a little bit.
Yeah.
So that's one issue. And
Okay.
if we were living in India, of course we would play the role of the musician going to the maker and saying, please make this, we don't like this, we like this, and so on. But literally, I mean, with tabla especially, or tabla heads, it's luck of the draw. They just pick whatever they have, put it in a box, and ship it, and you don't know what you're going to get.
Right.
So uh, so this was one motivating factor. The other thing is, even when you actually communicate to the maker that this is what we want, and an established artist is telling you as your middle person, this is what they want, they will still not listen, because they have over the generations decided this is the only way you can make this instrument, this is the only right way, and you cannot deviate from that. So in this particular case, what had happened is we wanted tanpuras that would play well in A sharp.
Okay.
And we wanted male A sharp tanpuras. So not the female ones, the male ones. So therefore, what does that mean? The tumba has to be bigger, the dand has to be bigger, the strings have to be thicker. It has to be a massive instrument. The bridge has to be a different size. There is a physics behind that, right? The length of the dand, the circumference of the tumba, the thickness of the string, the size of the bridge, all of these things have to be thought about in order to produce a stable A sharp sound. Well, these people, they just sort of moved the upper bridge up a little bit, and the length of the Tanpura is the same. The Tumba is the same. So as a result, when it arrived, yes, it plays in A sharp, but it's not an ideal sound. The strings are not nearly as tense as they need to be. It doesn't produce the nad that we want.
Mm.
It's really a very fine C sharp Tanpura, but
Oh,
not what we want.
okay.
So even with uh, intercession by an artist or a middle person, you don't know what's going to happen. So the thought was, um, we can start with the Tanpura because it is an instrument of some complexity, right? Uh, it does not have the drawback of being a drum in the sense that with a drum, the physics of the um, siahi, what's it called? You understand the black spot?
Right. Okay.
Yeah, the physics of that, the material science of that is, it's black magic. We don't know what's in there, right? You hear reports of magnesium, rice paste, wheat paste, you hear iron filings, but you don't really know what that is. And so to figure that piece out would be a major issue. Again, with a drum, like finding procuring the right thickness of leather and then finding a way to cure it, and like it's getting into a space that would be a little too difficult.
Mm.
So drums are ruled out. Something like a harmonium is so complex that you don't want to take that up initially. So is sitar. Sitar is a fairly complex instrument. On the other hand, here is an instrument that is essentially a stretched wire over a resonating chamber. Um, how hard could it be to create a mock-up at least and see what happens, right?
Mm. Mm.
So
So
that
let
was
me
the thought.
ask you one question. Sorry to interrupt, because until now I actually did not realize that the tumba and the stem of the tambura all have to be different based on the shrutis. I thought what you do is change strings and you adjust the tension like a violin. So for a tambura, for every shruti, you need different dimensions, is it, of the bass and the stem?
Kishan, you want to jump in? You look like you
Yeah,
want to jump
so I think it's not currently, it's not an exact science.
Okay.
What you just mentioned is definitely true and does work when you're taking the pitch up. So the theory holds when you take any tanpura of any large size and you want to take the pitch upwards, it's as simple as changing the thickness of the wires, and you will get the sound you want. Typically, a female tanpura would be smaller. Its dimensions are smaller. Traditionally, that is the common thing that's typical, that the female shruti tanpuras are smaller. But you can still take a male tanpura, change the wires, and turn it into a female one. It's doable.
Okay.
It is doable. The same cannot, that theory doesn't apply the opposite direction. That simply by taking any size tanpura and continuing to thicken the gauge of the wire, you do not end up with a lower pitch.
Oh,
When you're trying to go the opposite direction, the size of the instrument has to go up accordingly.
okay. Okay.
And this is proven in the Western world, right? Like you have the violin, viola, and then cello, so on and so forth until you get
And
to the
they get
double
more
bass,
bass
and
with
they
the
get
size,
bigger
right?
and thicker
Yeah.
and bigger and thicker as they go up.
Correct. Like the
So
double bass, which is so, I mean, which is at such a low pitch, right? Okay, I get
exactly.
that.
So the
Yeah,
size
so
of the,
essentially, it's a multifactorial problem. The changing the strings and tuning up and so on, those are certain factors. But as Kishan is saying, as you want to expand downward, you do need to change the structure of the instrument.
Okay.
Uh, and where this really kind of caused some kind of an intellectual dissonance in the maker is that, well, why do you need an A sharp male tanpura? Males don't sing in that pitch; they sing in
Mm.
C sharp. So there are certain boxes in which musicians and instruments have been sort of dropped in India. Like women can only sing in this range, men can only sing in this range. But these are matters of physiology, right? Um, Again, in the West, it's recognized, right? There's SATB. There's different uh, ranges within which a human voice can move based on one's physiology. And yeah, if you have a baritone vocalist, then he or she is not going to be able to use a C sharp D Tanpura. It's just not in the cards. So this is also, so ironically, this gave me insight into a lot of how Indian musicians and Indian gurus in particular deal with other students of music or students of music that come to them. You know, this dismissive thing of, oh, music is not for you, it's not in this lifetime, and so on and so forth. Where does this come from? This actually gave me insight into this, that essentially they do this to students because their pitches will not line up with the gurus. You know, it's a simple thing of you as a guru looking at the student and saying, you are not in my range, I have to adapt to teach you the music. But the instead, the message that's sent out is, if you're not in C sharp D and you're a male singer, then you can't sing.
Right.
So this process also gave me insight into the fact that, I mean, you see other things that are wrong with the music as a result of working
Hmm.
on this. So yeah, so that was kind of the motivation, and then finally the idea was that we'll start with the Tanpura, but eventually develop an indigenous capability so that one is not reliant on having to um, you know to be at the mercy of these makers who may or may not listen to what you want. And the idea also partially with this was that, yeah, we're doing a prototype, um, but something inside my head was telling me that, you know, you don't really need the finest rosewood and the best teak and all that stuff. This is a matter of physics, right? And materials aren't nearly as brittle in their abilities as they're made out to be in India. Like, you know, another thing that down the road that I really want to see happen is the creation of tablas that are not dependent on one block of wood. There's this
Yeah, you
weird
mentioned. Hmm.
superstition
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
a tabla has to come from one block of wood. I don't agree. I think
So
you can
each
create.
drum of a tabla has to be one contiguous piece of wood, is it? Is that
And that
that's
theory is applied across all percussion instruments in India, whether you're looking at dholaks, mridangam,
mridangam? Yeah,
I mean, dholak, mridangam, thavil, pakhavaj, tabla, whatever.
I see.
Um, it's all one massive portion of a
Block of
tree.
wood.
In the case of a thavil, is or mridangam is like a tree trunk,
Right.
literally,
Right.
that starts off yay thick and then is cut
Yes.
down, cut down, cut down, cut down, cut down to
Correct.
this.
Correct. Correct.
So, as opposed to the notion of trying to create something composite. So,
What is tabla made of? The drum? Is it also like jackfruit wood, or I have no idea?
no, so jackfruit is not a popular wood that is used in North Indian instruments at
Okay.
all. So there are no
Okay.
instruments in North India that are made from jackfruit wood.
Okay.
Tablas, the best quality tablas are known to be Kala Shisham,
Okay.
uh, which I don't have here. But then there's also another wood which I think is teak. I think it's teak,
Okay.
but I don't. It's not. It's like this drum that I have here. Sorry, Dabu, is not Kala Shisham.
Okay. Okay.
This
Isn't that
is
rosewood?
something else.
It's not rosewood, is it?
It's not rosewood. I think it's still shisham, but it's not kala shisham. Kala shisham is sort of the gold standard of tabla.
Got it.
It's a very very durable wood. It's very very thick, but the idea is that it is carved from one slab. It's
Got it.
one round.
Got it. Got it. And I was watching a documentary on, the parts of a tambura yesterday. And I think with the Tanjavur tambura, they were talking about, I think very similar to what you said. There are two varieties of wood that they use. And the teak is considered, teak is also used, but it's not used as much because of the weight. So maybe the shisham, if I know, is a lighter wood, if I know right. No?
Kala shisham is heavy, but I
Okay.
think
And you said you had used a tabla that had the correct resonance, that was not made of a single block of wood, right, Arijit? You had mentioned that.
I've seen. There was another tabla player in New York City one of his students, in a fit of creativity, had created a tabla made out of just various pieces of very beautiful wood, like colored woods and so on.
Oh,
And
okay.
he'd strapped on the head very nicely and brought it to the tabla player and said, "Guruji, please play this." And the man struck it once and he said, "I don't want this." I don't think that there's anything wrong with that tabla,
Okay.
right? I think if he had played it a little bit, it would have sounded just as good as anything else. So
Okay.
there are certain, you know, illogical blocks that are inside of musicians and makers, I feel.
I see. I see. I see. Okay. Oh, that's very interesting. Almost like he almost did the quilt of woods, so to speak, from what
It
you
was a
say.
very, very beautiful tabla. I've not seen anything like that since. And to me, the little bit that this musician played, it sounded just fine. It sounded very nice, actually, very resonant and very beautiful.
When
I
was
feel.
this?
This is in the early 2000s that I saw this.
So got that. Okay. So those two are, very relatable pieces of information for an average reader to understand, to kind of, you can now use smaller bits of wood potentially.
That's right.
Environmentally, it's very good too. So,
Exactly. That's exactly the point. And also the other point I would make is, the other related issue with Tanpura is that one can no longer source appropriate sized gourds in India because of climate change.
mm,
Uh, the gourds that are going to be large enough for an A-sharp Tanpura, for example, cannot be found in India. It has to be sourced from Madagascar.
oh,
And even for regular sized Tanpuras, gourds are not available. They have to be sourced from Africa, mostly from Madagascar.
yeah,
So there's also this issue to talk about as Tanpuras evolve, because yes, we don't have the wherewithal to have those kinds of materials anymore.
right,
So if not a gourd, then the question was, well, in South India, it's a carved piece of wood. So
right.
we just have to create a resonating chamber.
Okay. Oh, gods. You can even look at Sierra Leone because I grew up there and they used to have such humongous, what they used to call calabash.
Yes,
Yeah.
correct.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
they used to gather palm wine in it. They used to attach it to palm trees and collect
yeah,
the juice and make palm wine with it. So it used to happen in front of my own house when I was growing up.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
yeah. So those calabashes are actually used in instruments like the kora, the harp
I
that
see.
is found in Western Africa,
Ha, ha, ha.
and they can certainly be adapted to Hindustani tanpuras. Um, but for whatever reason, I think Madagascar is used as the source point. I don't know why,
No,
but the
it's
point
probably
is,
more accessible to India, let's say, right? Because Sierra Leone is like way up northwest, so it's not,
the
this is,
point being that they're not available in India.
got it.
So
I understood. I understood. Okay. So we are almost, by doing this, you're also showing the rest of the world that you're not dependent on a god.
right, it's a resonating chamber. It's not a gourd.
It's not a god. Now, have you ever thought of using all wood? I mean, like taking a leaf from the South Indian style, which seems to have never used a god.
So I'll let Kishan talk about the actual process of constructing this instrument and what went into the thinking behind that.
Now, in terms of costs, okay, while you're still here, I mean, Bhushan told me material costs were about $250, but there were like 400 hours of work that went in because I'd asked him for some time estimates, and obviously a lot of equipment, the electrical equipment, and which you should not amortize over, one instrument. I get that, but yeah, how would you, what do you think is the relative cost of making a tambura from start to finish, and how does it compare with what's in
Well,
India?
I think the 400 work hours is a little deceptive because we were working on our first prototype
Okay,
when there were things that went wrong. You
okay,
know, went wrong. There were false starts, and we had to redo things.
okay,
Um, so I don't think 400 work hours is indicative of what's required.
okay,
What is the right answer? I don't know, but it's not 400.
okay,
Um, I think obviously, if this was going to be a functional instrument and not a prototype, I would not necessarily go with plywood.
okay,
This was a quick and dirty. Well, not very quick, but kind of a let's try and create something and see what happens.
right,
Um, the point being that even with plywood and gobs of glue, we were
yeah,
able to produce a fairly good sound.
mm,
But if you're making an instrument that you want to play on stage, you want to play for your practice on a regular basis, then maybe plywood is not the nicest thing to take. But it doesn't have to be top of the line teak either. You know,
how would you rate the sound with its comparative instrument?
it's soft, quite functional in the sound. Um, Yeah, I think that that's not so much an issue of the materials used as much as the final thickness of the resonating chamber.
Okay.
The positioning of sound holes. I don't. Was there a sound hole in this one? I don't know. There was no sound hole. I think you need to put in a meaningful sound hole. And the dand was hollow, but you, I don't remember.
It
Not
was.
as hollow as we could have been, but yes.
Yeah, so there you go. So that, I think it's a function of that. The thickness of the materials.
Hmm.
It was again a prototype. It wasn't meant to be a function of the instrument. The
Right.
thickness of the materials, the thickness of the barrier through which sound had to travel
Got it.
was much thicker than what we would like.
So if we had the stem and the barrel, everything a lot thinner, it would probably be resonate better and produce even better sound.
Yeah.
Not to speak of being lighter, I suppose.
Yes, correct.
And if you didn't have glue in it, which probably also adds to the weight, I'm thinking.
It certainly adds to the weight, but I don't think that's really the major factor. I think the major factor is the plywood and the thickness of the plywood and the weight of the plywood.
Now, do you think something like a maple or a cedar or a locally available wood would work for this?
So in terms of materials, I think we're still in the process of I'm lucky enough to have a student who is a cabinet maker by profession, and so
Oh, okay.
he does a lot of woodworking. He builds
Mm.
custom furniture, and he's not a luthier, and he recognizes that. But I think what he was saying is that it's worth trying. I don't, again, because I don't know the qualities of all these woods right off the top of my head yet. This process is sort of the supposed to get me to a point where I'm more familiar with the properties of all these different types of woods. The question is, again, it's not the, as Guruji mentioned, uh, it's more, it more so has to do with how it's constructed more than the wood
Wood.
itself.
Okay.
You know, like even I was watching just today, I was watching a video about the construction of sarods and shit and sitars, and the maker was saying that tune wood, which is more commonly, which is the most popular wood used for North Indian instruments, produces a much softer tone, softer, more sweeter tone, whereas if you use a harder wood like shegun, I'm not sure how you say shegun in English, but shegun erkat. If you use that, then it's a heavier wood, which means the sound is slightly thinner, but it's a
Mm.
little bit more powerful. So it's how much I don't think I have the qualification to say yay or nay on that theory, but I do still stand by what Guruji said, which is that it's more so how the piece is constructed
Got it.
that matters.
So it's more like the thickness of whatever material you're using, the the length and the length of the chamber, how much of a resonating chamber you have, and things like that that add more to the sound, more than the wood itself. The wood is just a shell. It's almost like the pizza crust being a delivery mechanism for the cheese. So
Sure.
very bad analogy, but
Yeah.
Arijit is
So
probably scandalized. I would equate it to pizza.
I like pizza.
I
I
love
wouldn't.
pizza. Arijit, sorry, I have very banal tastes in a lot of things. Food is one of them. So,
yeah, so
so
it's not so much what kind of wood, it's more so how you treat, how you what you do with it that I think
mm,
matters more.
okay,
And I think in this day and age, what my student also told me is that, and Guruji's also mentioned this, that gluing technology has greatly evolved over the course of time, and not all of these technologies have reached India the same way.
okay,
Um, and so the tools, the kinds of glues, the different options, like even in the process of my own experiment, which I was doing with my Israj, I didn't realize that there were so many different types of adhesive options that all yield very specific results,
I
and they're
see.
there for very specific things. So are those same technologies or those sorts of, is that same knowledge base used in India? Is it there in that
Mm,
sort of culture? But as Guruji mentioned, right, it's a very Bap Dada sort of parampara style of family arts and crafts that have come down, and those methods are not challenged or changed.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so we don't have reason to suspect that such things might happen in India with this evolution of how materials work and what
So,
you could do.
Arijit, you had mentioned you also worked with a luthier in Europe, right? For what did you work with him on to get some perspective?
I think Kishan should talk about that.
Okay.
Sure. So the luthier's name was why is his name escaping my head?
Ed.
Edward Powell. So Edward Powell, he is a lute maker. So he is someone who has he has learned how to make ouds, and by extension, he has started making many fused instruments. Like he has this instrument which he calls a rag makta or something like that, which is a triple neck. It's one shell, three necks,
Oh,
a lute, a guitar, and a sarod, all on one
okay.
contraption.
Okay.
So it's
Got it.
his research and his discoveries have led him to create more instruments, and he's fusing all these instruments together to create something new. But he's a very innovative person. Um, he has worked at length with other instrumentalists and sarodias, and he managed to create a sarod using the same techniques used to build an oud.
Oh, okay.
Through which he not only built a sarod, he also built a surshringar.
Okay.
So the idea, when we saw that project happen, this is when that sort of idea arose that, okay, can we extend that process and create a tanpura out of it? If you can create a sarod, then there's a good chance you can create a tanpura too. So it's sort of the why not
Okay.
mentality in that process. So Edward, we started talking to him and we decided that we want to try to build an instrument through him. And so we talked to him about using the methods that he used for an oud, to go ahead and try to use the same ideas to create a tanpura of. And at that point we were saying, okay, we want it to be this size. And that was sort of for me, that was the first illuminating process to see how an instrument maker uses engineering and physics to actually determine. Like, all I told him was, what he asked me is, give me the measurements of your best tanpura and the pitch it plays in. So I took Dinkar Kaikini's tanpura and told him, here's how tall it is, here's the circumference of the tumba, here's the circumference of the darnd, all these things I gave him, and I said, here's the gauge of the strings, here's the pitch it plays in. In a matter of a couple of days, he sent back saying, if you want an A sharp tanpura, then bam, 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 bam. Here's how thick, here's how
Okay.
long, here's the circumference, here's this.
Okay.
Here's exactly how much it has to go up to achieve the pitch that you want.
So he was actually using science, and he was completely uninhibited by, all this tradition, and you can't do this. So it must have been very refreshing. Even for me to hear it is really nice.
Yes, absolutely. So he literally came back he came back in two scenarios. He said, here's a scenario where you change the gauge, and here's a scenario where you keep the same gauge. And he came back and said, here's exactly how much percent the instrument has to go up. And when he did it, he added 7 inches to the current male tanpura.
7 inches.
Was effectively as tall as I am. What we also talked about is that, there are some tanpuras that have air holes, some tanpuras that don't. And he gave a very detailed explanation as to what is a sound hole, why is it necessary, how do you determine how big to make that sound hole. And I took a science of music course at Penn State, and I was able to connect, at least in layman's terms, I was able to sort of see how the thought processes worked behind creating these instruments, where the sound hole has to be carved in a way where the size of the sound hole determines the pitch of the tumba itself. So the tumba itself has a pitch depending on its size.
Oh, I see.
And when you hum that pitch into the tumba, you either get a standing wave or you get multiple waves. What you don't want is a standing wave. And you get a standing wave depending on the size of that hole. So, and if you're creating a tanpura to this pitch of A sharp, then you want the pitch of your tumba to be slightly above it so that it does not create a standing wave, which causes things to cut out in the frequency spectrum. So all these sorts of things he really enlightened. It was enlightening for me, especially to see that, oh, okay, there is actual science to this entire process.
So it's actually, you probably came out of it realizing it is actually science. It is not anything other than science, actually. That's
correct.
It is.
Everything can be put down to rubrics.
Exactly.
So basically the idea was to take what's there in India and try to replicate it first,
right,
and then to try and work with somebody to gain the actual science behind it to move the design forward. Right. That's where.
So did you speak to Mr. Powell before you embarked on starting on the State College Tambura?
No.
Okay.
So
or you were having a different thread.
Did. And what I mean by we did is that, see, what ended up happening with Ed is that the Western world is amazing in one way, which is that instrument makers make fantastic instruments. They put it at the price where the instrument is worth. Anyone can buy it at that price.
Right.
In the case of Ed, undergoing this project was quite expensive, and so we didn't have the funding necessary to do it at that time. But we had a student, one of my guru bhais was interested in procuring a tanpura, and so he decided that this would be his instrument. So once we were able to do that, then once the funding question was handled, then we decided to go that route with him.
Okay.
But they sort of, in some ways, they happen somewhat parallelly.
Okay.
In some ways.
Okay.
Because after all, the project with Bhushan Uncle, it went on. Like, it was more than a year that we had continued efforts to restart, try.
I mean, how does one reverse engineer a tambura? Because normally when you reverse engineer something, you break it up. And I'm assuming you guys did not like cleave open a tambura or something to see what's inside.
We didn't do that. We didn't do that. We definitely didn't open up a tanpura just to see what the deal was.
Yeah.
So when we saw that Ed was doing this and we heard the sarods that he was making, the other thing about Ed was that he was also substituting the leather skin of the sarod for a wood skin. I mean, not a skin, a wood faceplate.
Right.
And that naturally also came, it did alter the sound a bit, but it was still a very pleasing sound for the sarod. It wasn't like a make or break situation. But
and Arijit had mentioned you changed the faceplate of your Esraj.
I did.
Yes.
And we went through a full process with that as well, which I'm happy to talk to you about also.
Mm-hmm.
So when it came to the oud, basically what happened is that once we saw Edward going through his process online, I began to follow his work pretty closely. And I think Guruji found a book on oud making. It's a very small pamphlet, but there was this one oud maker who created a very concise book on how he built an oud. And that book has all the information necessary to create one. You know, what kind of tools you need, what thickness, what wood, so just to give you an insight into it, how is a tumba created without a tumba? So basically what happens is that in oud making, strips of wood are cut out to a very specific thickness, and then they are tapered. So it starts off here, sort of goes up like this, and then tapers at the top. And it continues to taper, but at a very specific measurement, so that when you have multiple strips like that, all those strips are soaked or steamed to soften them, and they are secured over a stencil, which is this shape.
I see.
So once all those strips have been secured onto that stencil, then they take that shape. Once you take them all off, when you glue all those strips together, because of the way they have been tapered in their shape, they automatically do this. They create that gourd.
Okay.
They create the shape of that gourd. So using this process, we thought that, there's no reason why it can't happen for tanpura. It worked for oud, it worked for sarod, it can absolutely work for tanpura as well.
I see.
So we got this book and we approached Bhushan Uncle to say, why don't we try what's there in this book? Okay. Naturally, funding is and always is sort of an issue. So we couldn't naturally get all the specific, tools and the machinery and the materials to make it happen exactly as per that book. Bhushan Uncle is an extremely creative person, so he decided to improvise based off of the things we showed him. So in the first round, what we did was, we never finished the first round. The first round we started and then it just sort of fell out. So Bhushan Uncle's theory in the first round was that, okay, let's create a prototype, let's create the mold. And the mold he created was using plaster of Paris. So Bhushan Uncle was driving to Washington, D.C. one fine day with Lata Auntie, and on their way there or on their way back or something, there was this farmer who was selling massive pumpkins. So Bhushan Uncle saw that, knowing this project is coming, got 3 or 4 of those massive pumpkins and brought them
Halloween
home.
Pumpkins, those monster ones. Yes.
So he bought them, put them in the car, brought them home. So now we have pumpkins. So the first step was to, open those pumpkins and hollow them out.
Yep.
Once we hollowed them out and we dried them up a little, we couldn't dry them. We don't have the tools needed to dry an actual
Plus, it will start rotting because there are actually chemicals that you apply to them to allow them to dry without rotting, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so what we did instead is we mixed plaster of Paris and we filled the pumpkin with plaster of Paris.
Okay.
And he also attached a PVC pipe and created the darn out of a PVC pipe.
But give me a second. So if he filled the pumpkin with plaster of Paris, you would not have a hollow chamber, right? Or did he
But
cover
he
the
filled, so
pumpkin with plaster
no,
of
no. So
Paris?
he filled the pumpkin, but then we removed the pumpkin shell. So what we were left with was a what's that term?
It's basically the inner chamber, if it was to be conceptualized as a solid block. That's what
Okay,
you end up.
got it. So it would have been
There's a-
solid. That is what I'm trying to
Yeah,
get.
it was a solid
It was a
circle.
solid, not a hollowed out
Right.
thing. Okay,
Right.
got it,
Correct.
got it, got it.
So
Because
now
I was thinking you could potentially rub plaster of Paris on the exterior of the pumpkin. Of course, the pumpkin has ridges, so that's a problem, you know, so it's
yeah,
not
it is a problem.
completely a
Right.
smooth surface. So
Right. Exactly. So we filled the pumpkin. There's a term that's used in the art world for this. I keep forgetting what relief.
okay.
Is that what is this, Guruji?
It's a mold basically, but
A
yeah,
mold,
relief.
yeah, but I think it's relief work is what it's called, I think. But basically we filled the pumpkin and then we removed the pumpkin shell. So then what we were left with is the filled pumpkin.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Now Bhushan uncle, because we didn't have the tools for the first method that was in the book, what he decided is, why don't we recreate the tumba by using wood shavings and wood glue. So what he would then, what the plan was, is we got a gallon of wood glue and we got a 5-pound bag of sawdust.
Okay.
So what his plan was is to cover the tumba that we made in a parchment paper or something like that, and then drizzle and layer this mixture of wood glue and sawdust continuously until we reach a certain thickness. Now, in turn that would create the tumba. Now, in retrospect, that sort of creates something similar to what would be considered fiberglass. Similar, not exactly the same, because of the amount of glue used. You're pretty much stuck with a massive lump of glue that's that's shaped in that.
Right.
The wood in that is very minimal in the grand scheme of things. But nonetheless, that was the plan we had, and that did not happen. For some reason, we just didn't go ahead with that idea. So chalo, we didn't go ahead with it. There was a long break, and then sorry, I should rephrase this. We did want to try the wood shaping method, and I remember we went and we tried balsa. Balsa is the wood that is used to create model airplanes.
Right.
So it's very light.
It's
a very soft wood.
Yes.
So we thought, okay, let's go get some balsa strips from Penn State, from the bookstore, and we brought them home into Guruji's, and we laid them out into his bathtub, and then we forgot about them until like 3 months ago. So we did get the balsa, but the thing about balsa we still realize is that it's soft and it's malleable, but not so malleable to the point where it would hold onto this. It would hold its form. Balsa is not a wood that form. So you still need a stronger piece of wood to do that.
Okay.
So those are the two first things that we theorized. We went ahead and made this massive Tanpura shape, which also sat in our garage for many years to follow.
Okay.
So chalo, all this happened, and then the project started, finished, and then.
So when did you do this filling the pumpkin thing? Which year would that have been?
I think 15.
Okay.
16, 15, 16, somewhere around there.
Okay.
I think. I don't quite remember myself anymore, but.
Okay.
But yeah, so that happened, and then finally, Bhushan uncle, this idea dawned upon him, is to take plywood, multiple strips of plywood, and then try this idea.
Okay.
So in the end, did we get to try the oud method? No, we didn't get to try it. Ed did it for us, and he created the instrument successfully, and it's currently in my Guru Bhai's home.
And what instrument did he make? That was a tambura too?
Tanpura. He made the Tanpura according to his model. So he was able to successfully create the Tanpura that he talked to us about.
So what was that, a C sharp, or was that one of the?
That was an A sharp.
Oh, excellent. So, and that you were happy with the sound of the A sharp that you got from that? Yeah.
I think the factors that we were unhappy with had little to do with the body itself.
Okay.
So for me, when Deepak brought the Tanpura here, my Guru Bhai brought it here, and we played it, to me, it was a little bit too jarring. Okay. Like the sound was a little bit too sharp, but again, that's not a function of the instrument, it's the function of the javari. So that means...
What is a javari now?
The javari is the bridge that the strings sit on. So the curvature of that bridge and the shaving of that bridge is what determines how much of a buzz is. The jiva of the Tanpura comes from that buzz.
That you
And that
mean
is something.
the bridge that sits on the tumba, right? Not
Yeah.
the one on the top half of
No,
oh,
the bridge that sits on the tumba.
on the tumba. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So that bridge, it has more to do with the bridge than it does with the body. The body,
Okay.
I think, was sound. It was very much a sound body, which perfectly works. There's no reason why it doesn't.
Okay.
So that
And
that was
the bridge earlier used to be of ivory, right? Which is now a prohibited product, of course.
Yeah.
ivory and then deer horn
Deer horn.
are
Okay.
used. And actually, what I learned recently is that it's actually very difficult to find a Tanpura bridge which is fully of deer horn. And what I mean by fully
Oh.
is that we had a Tanpura that Tumba broke after we already finished this project.
Oh.
So the one insight we could have had into the Tanpura we didn't have at that time. But
Oh
when it
boy.
broke,
Mm.
I decided that when I underwent my Israj experiment, I thought that the plate at the part of the bridge which the feet sit on, I thought
Mm-hmm.
that was one proper piece of deer horn or whatever that material is. So I thought, okay, if I need to rebuild my Israj bridge, I have the material to do it. So chalo, I went ahead and took this bridge from this cheap Tanpura and I undid the whole thing, assuming that I'll be left with a solid piece of whatever.
Mm.
Turns out that that piece is also hollow.
Oh. Oh.
So that piece is also not a perfectly flat, a whole piece of that material. It's one part on top, two on the side, and one on the bottom to create
Oh.
one whole
So it's
piece.
like a rectangle. It's or rather it's a cuboid to be
Yeah,
perfectly accurate. Okay.
that sat on 2 feet, and then that was a Tanpura bridge.
Ah.
So, but not all Tanpura bridges are like that. It's just harder to find ones which are whole pieces.
Does that make a difference in the sound to have a hollowed cuboid versus a solid piece of whatever?
What does Guruji think on that one?
Jury's out. I think they've been using these hollow bridges, and people don't complain.
Yeah, so
No
that
one stops to
works.
ask, right?
Right. Well, until you told me, I mean, I doubt any of the readers who are reading this, even so-called, tambura experts, even know that that's how it is. Because how often do you have a tambura that breaks? I hope you saved that broken tambura like a treasure, Kishan, because the
We
next.
fixed it actually. My Guru
Oh,
Bhai and I, my Guru Bhai reconstructed the tumba from the broken pieces.
oh, okay.
Yeah, I got to watch him actually put the tumba back together. You know how in Lata Ananteshwaran's house, Swami Mama also did the same thing with one of their tanpuras? I'm not sure
No,
if you've seen
actually, I
it.
don't know. That might have
But
been
Swami
after my
Mama went
time.
ahead and did the same thing. But
I see.
Kamal, he's a sitar player himself, and so he's had to go through this process of putting together a broken tumba. So I got to watch him do that with this tanpura
Is
also.
it just like gluing back a piece of china? I'm just asking, or is it something more than that when you do that?
Yeah, it's pretty much that. I think it's
Okay.
yeah, it has to be done with multiple hands, and it's at least gluing china. There's one end that's perfectly open. Here
Right.
we're trying to fit it into a very specific spot on the tanpura, and so
Absolutely. No, I get that. But the reason I asked that question is, again, if you're able to refurbish it to a point where it's usable, that's again breaking the belief that it has to be one solid contiguous
absolutely,
piece,
It
right?
doesn't.
It doesn't. So
Doesn't.
that's what I'm trying to see. I mean, you have found it even practically that you can fix a broken. You didn't replace the tumba. You fixed the broken one. You glued it back together, and it still works.
It still
So
works.
whether it's a
Absolutely.
mridangam or a tabla or a tambura, you can actually use multiple pieces of wood and come up with a working instrument that provides satisfaction. I mean, yeah. In fact, I would love for you guys to take one of these instruments, give it to an unsuspecting artist who has no idea what it's been made by, and then have their feedback. Because the moment you tell somebody, it's like the tabla guy, Arijit, that you just said, right? I mean, he just touched it. He said he didn't want it. What if it had been covered in something? I mean, I don't know if tablas come with covers, but mridangams have these, the little covers that people put on them, right?
Yeah.
What if you had put a cover on it and it looked just the same, like a traditional tambura? I mean, a traditional tabla, and then he had played on it, would he have said the same thing? It would just have been nice to see that.
Well, I mean, so when Kishan's Esraj face split, right, he contacted the musician who had interceded for him to get that instrument.
Right.
And that musician said, "Well, you're going to have to start from a new instrument. There's no way to, like, once
To
that
buy a
split."
new instrument.
Yeah. No
Hmm.
point in replacing it, and like you'll never be able to do it. It's a
Right.
useless instrument. So, and Kishan can share plenty of samples of his playing on this reconstructed
Yeah.
face now.
Hmm.
So
I challenge.
that too, we went through multiple different trials. We didn't
Yeah,
just
we did.
land on
We
this
did. It
one.
was quite a project. But I challenge anyone to listen to that Esraj and say, "Oh, that one, it's defective in any way."
Yeah.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
sounds just as sweet or sweeter sometimes.
Yeah.
And what did
So
you use? What is the normally used original material, and what did you use as a
goat skin.
substitute?
So typically what's used is animal skin, I think goat,
Okay.
if I'm not mistaken. And it's a fairly thin piece of wood. Now the thing about the Israj, there is no standardization. There's no consistency in sound with
Okay.
this particular instrument. The model of the Israj which I play is called the Boro Israj, the Shantiniketan Israj, which only goes back about a generation and a half from me. So the person to have created it would have been somewhere between, just maybe slightly senior to Guruji. So nonetheless, the Ranadir Roy model of the Israj is not that old. And so and even he only came to that model towards the end of his life. He didn't have it for too long before he passed away. He passed away very young. So it was a bit of a that model of the Israj. There was one maker, one. He used exactly one maker. Now there are two, and
Okay.
that one maker currently lives in Kolkata and is the son of the original maker who went through the process of creating that instrument.
Right.
The Israj, otherwise, there's no consistency in how two instruments sound.
Understood.
And that is again something that we were trying to understand about Indian instruments, is that at least when you get Jodi Tanpuras made, then they do sound the same. It's not like the two of them sound drastically different. Whereas in this case, this particular instrument, no two Israjes sound alike.
Okay.
So it was a question of trying to understand how can we standardize this process to make sound more consistent.
Hmm.
The model of the Israj, which I got through a mass instrument producer,
Okay.
Manoj Kumar Sardar. He built this a copy of the Shantiniketan model of the Israj. And yes, naturally the sound was different, and it sounded much more like a sarangi to me than it did an Israj in terms of its tone. Uh, and so when my skin broke and I was told that, oh, you just have to get a brand new instrument, we were like, okay, no, let's not do that. And then the conversation continued that we live in America. We need something a little bit more sturdy in terms of its how it handles weather fluctuations and things like that. And so we decided to try wood. And I have documented this process very meticulously. So uh, my student Jeff is the one who built the faceplate.
Hmm.
He mentioned the thickness, he mentioned how he made it. I played it, we recorded it, I performed with it, and then we still weren't happy with the sound. So the thing that we realized in this process is that the thickness of the faceplate does matter, and this holds for any instrument wherein a bridge is sitting on something and sending sound through the body of the instrument.
So
The
that
thickness
would
of the
translate to the tambura again.
Exactly. So the thickness of that faceplate, or where the thickness of the thing which the membrane which the bridge is sitting on does matter in this
Right.
case.
Right. Right.
But material is still up for grabs, because at the end of the day, the Israj is traditionally done with skin.
Hmm.
The first glimmer of success that we had with wood happened, and it was a very short-lived success in that we got the wood thing, and I was extremely hesitant to change it.
Okay.
Like Guruji kept saying, thin it out, thin it out, thin it out. And for some reason, I just didn't want to mess with it because I didn't want to lose that instrument again.
Okay.
So I was very hesitant to it, but finally I did it. And I got it down to a thickness that created such a beautiful, resonant, sweet tone
I see. Okay.
that is even unparalleled to having the actual goat skin. It was just
Okay.
an overall better sound.
Lovely. Hmm.
But the thing is that the thickness that demanded couldn't sustain the weight of the strings. So within about a 48-hour span of time, the bridge gave in. And then I had cracks, and then the tone changed.
Yeah, of course.
Um, and so I talked to Jeff about possibly doing it again and putting posts underneath it to support the 2 points where the bridge comes in contact with the membrane. And what he said is that, and I actually later understood this a little bit better, when you have a wooden faceplate and you play something on it, and then you touch the wooden faceplate and and then just put your hand on it,
Hmm.
it mutes it. So
It
that
does.
faceplate also resonates.
Mm-hmm.
The minute you touch it or you mute that wooden shell or whatever, like even a tanpura, and I have another example with this for tanpura as well, that when you mute it, the sound gets muted
Of course.
and it doesn't resonate as
Gotcha.
well. I had this tanpura, a 6 string tanpura that my dad bought me, and it had a cloth strip on the bottom of the tumba as a comfort. When you're sitting with the tanpura, then the cloth strip was there for comfort.
Like the
And
pad for the violin on the shoulder. Yeah.
sure,
Yeah.
but that tanpura was never bright. It never had that
Ah,
brilliance that a tanpura should. So when I took it to Jeff Lewis, Jeff was like, "Oh, hold that thing off." Bam. Suddenly
okay.
that tanpura was a functioning tanpura again.
I see.
So
Got it.
when I suggested this idea of putting the pegs underneath to support the membrane, Jeff said that that would mute it, and we didn't want. For some reason, deliberations never continued on that. I'm sure we could have found a way, but
Right.
for what
Right. Understood.
going forward for the Israj. So again, we went through 2 rounds of trying a wooden faceplate with the Israj. In the second round, I did also talk to Ed again and say that this is the issue I ran into. What he suggested is that the Israj bridge has 2 legs on it and it's hollow in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a leg, and then nothing in between. Naturally,
Right.
what that does is the weight of the strings falls on 2 discrete points.
Right.
And so the wood is going to cave on those
Okay.
2 points.
Okay.
Whereas if you create a flat bridge,
Okay.
which has none of that, then the weight is more evenly dispersed and the chances of breaking are fewer.
Okay.
Chalo, Jeff did that. He created me a bridge that was flat, all that stuff happened. Again, he knew that past a certain thickness, the wood is going to break. He knew that.
Okay.
But it wasn't the sound we wanted. So there again, I went in and shaved it down. Lo and behold, cracked again.
Oh.
So that was a repetitive theme with the wood. Now, the next thing Guruji said is, okay, why don't you try synthetic heads?
Okay.
So synthetic head, what I mean by actually, if my house was in park, I'd literally show you what I mean by synthetic heads. So in the Western world, drum set players use plastic heads.
Okay.
Now, the thing about plastic heads in the West is that they have been developed, studied, researched in innumerable ways to
Right.
create a multitude of sounds to cover so many indigenous types of drums also. Like many folk drums of different parts of the country have been recreated with the similar sound, if not perfectly authentic representations. So you might even know this, like Selva Kumar,
Selva
the
Ganesh.
Ganjira artist. Selva
Selva
Ganesh, yes.
Ganesh. Selva Ganesh.
Yes.
Ah.
So Selva Ganesh, he's a big, he's an ambassador for the Remo Ganjira.
Yes.
There's a Ganjira that's made by Remo, right? And that
Right.
is supposed to be the closest representation of a synthetic head to that.
Mm-hmm.
So when this synthetic head option started, I tried reaching out to Remo to say, can I just have a sheet of that skin? The idea being that if it works for Ganjira, then why wouldn't it work for Israj?
Right.
So, but they said, it's our patent, we don't just give that out.
Okay.
If you want it, buy the drum. But the thing about buying the drum is, A, I have to get the drum, and B, the drum is smaller than how much skin I needed for this purpose.
Got it.
So that actually didn't work. But chalo. Later, what I thought, then we said, okay, let me get the thinnest possible drum that I can find.
Okay.
So the thinnest possible head, I did my research. I was a percussionist in high school, so I knew what to look for. And I got the thinnest applied drum head that I could find.
Okay.
And I took that. The question is how do I secure this tightly to the shell that I needed to put it on?
Okay.
So that's always a question. Like you'll notice that on any instrument where there's a leather head,
Mm-hmm.
the weight of the bridge dives the head. It goes in, it sinks a little bit.
Okay.
So the idea was that first of all, I had to find a way to glue it. What glue should be used, and
Mm-hmm.
secondly, I should find a way to make sure that when I secure it, the tightness of the head is fixed.
Okay.
It's not something that I will have to tighten as I
Correct.
go.
Yes, it has to stay continuously at the same level of tautness throughout without requiring adjustment.
Exactly. Right. Now, how do you do that with a drum head? Now, the only way to tighten a drum head is to secure it on a drum.
Right.
So I went on Amazon, bought the cheapest snare drum of the same diameter that I could find. Okay. And I cut the snare drum just enough so that I could slide the dand of my Israj into it.
Okay.
And then what I did is I secured that drum head to that snare drum.
Okay.
And then I I put my israj down, applied the glue, took the drum head, put it upside down onto the israj, and then layered books and these. I took all the stands off the bottoms of my mics and put
Okay.
them on as weights, put them into a nice flowering pot, and just let it sit for 24 hours. And that
Okay.
did the trick. It was
Oh,
a simple. Um, there are some things that I need to still think through in this process. Like the final part of once you chalo, now that it's been secured, I cut the drum head free of its rim and then trim the edges, but you need to have some leeway so that if it does begin to fall in, then there's something still holding it. So you need to be able to fold it around the edges in a way that secures it to that body. And that's the step I have yet to figure out. But all said and done, I did this over COVID, right? So this was what, uh, March or April, maybe May. It was May. So between May and now, my scratch nothing has happened to it. It's just as sound as it was the day I put it on.
you have learned a lot about instruments, various parts of the instruments. So now if you were to, how would you go about creating a tambura again if you were to do it? I get the aspect that we'll now use a block of wood versus plywood. So that part of it I get, and we'll make it thinner. But anything else that you've learned in the process?
There are other instruments that I would like us to work on also. The issue is one of SIMA being a very small organization and we being slammed with many projects trying to get them out the door. So, but I think my sense is that down the road, 3, 4, 5 years from now, you will be starting to see other innovations coming out of this process.
Okay.
Um, but it's a matter of just being stalled. As far as what the Tanpura requires, I think Ed has answered that question. It's not so much that it's made out of a block of wood, but its process is involved. It requires some amount of carpentry skill, which we don't have in house at the moment. But so that definitely is the way to go, because then the tumba can be as large or as small or whatever, and the quality of the wood, because you're not dealing with plywood, you can thin down the wood to the degree that you need without
Right.
compromising the structure of the instrument. So yeah,
And it'll
it's entirely.
probably also require less sanding, I'm thinking, because one of the things with plywood is you're going to need a lot of sanding because there are all so many individual pieces, right? This is way easier to sand. I'm thinking. I'm not an expert woodworker, but I'm just logically thinking about it.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I
yeah,
think in the case of the Bhushan uncle model that we're dealing with right now, there was a lot of sanding involved
Yeah.
simply to get the akar right. I think if I was to try doing this project again, I think the one thing that I've learned is that yes, there are certain ways to improvise things that you don't have in a cost-effective way, but there are some things that you just can't go
Right.
around.
Absolutely.
And in the case of constructing wooden bodies to sustain these instruments, there's just a handful of things which you just simply must have. And
And
so
what are these? And what are the
typical
must?
band saws, drill presses, a circular saw, a table saw, electric sanders, a router that allows you to shave inside,
Okay.
and a tool that will allow me to carve my own pegs. Like there are some tools that you simply cannot avoid
Got it.
in the process. So that's something that if I was to do this again, then I need to make sure that I have. And we even when I got this house, we decided that okay, let's try to work in a direction where I can build up these instruments with the course of time, all these things that I need.
Right.
Then let's work to build them up. And yes, my student is not a luthier, but we know enough luthiers, and he has the know-how on how to use these tools.
Got
So
it.
nonetheless, it's still something that can be a guided process that I can embark on. But it's
Understood.
again, there's the
Right.
question of